Hello, welcome to MTG. We're here for another episode of Good Clean Commander. I'm Ashley, and
Hello, my name is Ken. It's very nice to meet you or see you again, depending on when you clicked on this video.
depending if this is your first time.
Right.
Today we're joined by two friends, Chris from Spell Table Splits, you might have seen them before, and also our other friend, Shaff, who is that mill guy on YouTube. And don't worry, they're not playing a mill deck today, so
No, mono red. But it was a fun, silly game full of all kinds of shenanigans and
it was a
all
3 hour
kinds of
game.
interactions. Yeah,
It
yeah, the
was
original game. Yeah.
I think all of our brains were melted by the end of it because let's just say there is quite a few board wipes and interactions that went down. So hope y'all enjoy and let's have
Have a clean
good, clean
game.
game.
Good, good.
Shaff is playing Ragavan, Nimble Pilfer. This deck wants to disrupt opponents through Blood Moon effects and land destruction in order to gain advantage on opponents and storm off for the win. And in Shaff's starting hand, he has 2 mountains, Valakut, the Molten Pinnacle, Bergi, God of Storytelling, Magus of the Moon, Koth of the Hammer, and an Arcane Signet. I am playing Taigam, Ojutai Master. My deck wants to rebound spells with my commander's ability while also copying what my opponents are doing by either stealing their cards or making copies of them. And in my starting hand I have a Port Town, Castle Ardenvale, Esper Sentinel, Swords to Plowshares, Sakashima's Will, Kira Great Glass Spinner, and a Talisman of Progress. Chris is playing Brenard, Ginger Sculptor, and he wants to double up on value by making cookie tokens of his creatures. Hoping to build up a token army, this deck wants to win through Craterhoof bonks or good old-fashioned go-wide strategies. And in his starting hand, Chris has a Misty Rainforest, a Forest, Canopy Vista, Selfless Spirit, Birthing Pod, Farseek, and Mondrak Glory Dominus. Ken is playing Alela, Cunning Conqueror. This fairy control deck wants to cast spells on other opponents' turns in order to trigger Alela's ability to make more fairies. Hoping to get other opponents to beat each other down with goat effects, this mischievous deck is one to watch out for. And in his starting hand, Ken has a Mystic Sanctuary, Temple of Deceit, a Swamp, Fairy Dream Thief, Glen Elendra Archmage, Born Upon a Wind, and a Puppeteer Click. Shaft starts off the game by drawing and playing a mountain as land for turn. He then pays 1 to cast his commander Ragavan, Nimble Pilferer. Shaft then passes to me. I draw and play a tapped Castle Ardenvale and pass to Chris. Chris draws and plays a Misty Rainforest. He immediately pays 1 life to crack it and goes to 39 to fetch up a tapped Spara's Headquarters. Chris then passes to Ken. Ken draws and plays a swamp as land for turn. He then pays 1 for a Fairy Dream Thief. On ETB, Ken scries 1 and chooses to leave that card on top. Happy to have a blocker against Ragavan, he passes to Shaft. Shaft untaps, draws, and decides to go right to combat. Before deciding who to swing at, Shaft rolls a dice to determine who he will bonk first. Chris loses the dice roll, so Shaft attacks Chris. Unable to block, Chris takes 2 damage, going to 37 life. Ragavan triggers when combat damage is dealt to a player, so Chris exiles the top card of his library and Shaft can cast that card. Ragavan also creates 1 treasure token. Chris then exiles a phantasmal image, and Shaft doesn't want to cast it, so the card is permanently exiled. Second main phase, Shaft pays 2 to cast an Arcane Signet. He then follows that up by casting a Sword of the Animist for 2 mana and passes the turn to me. I untap, draw, and play a Port Town, revealing an island, so it enters untapped. I then pay 2 for an Arcane Signet. Tapping the Arcane Signet, I follow that up by paying 1 for Esper Sentinel. Bamboozling the Ragavan with a blocker, I then pass to Chris. Chris untaps, draws, and plays a Forest as land for turn. He then pays 2 for a Selfless Spirit. Chris then passes to Ken. Ken untaps, draws, and plays an island as land for turn. He then pays 2 for an Arcane Signet. Unable to pay the 1, Esper triggers and I draw a card. Ken then passes to Shaft. Chef untaps, draws, and plays a mountain as land for turn. He then pays 4 for a Koth of the Hammer. Esper triggers, and Chef can't pay the 1, so I draw. He then removes 2 loyalty counters from Koth, putting them down to 1 loyalty total to create a floating red mana for each mountain he controls. This makes Chef 3 floating mana. He uses it to cast a Magus of the Moon, making all non-basic lands mountains. He then passes the turn to me. I untap, draw, and play an island as land for turn. I then pay 4 to cast Sakashima's Will, targeting Shaft, and I make him choose a creature he controls to give to me. Shaft gives me control of Ragavan, and moving to combat, I swing Ragavan at Shaft. Not wanting to lose Magus of the Moon, he takes the damage where Ragavan triggers, and he exiles Cathartic Reunion. I also make a treasure token. Unable to cast the Cathartic Reunion, it is permanently exiled, and with that, I pass the turn to Chris. Chris untaps, draws, and tries to figure out a way around the Magus of the Moon. He plays a tapped Canopy Vista as land per turn and follows it up with a Farseek to grab an island and put it into play tapped. He then passes to Ken. Ken untaps, draws, and plays a tapped Mystic Sanctuary, and with that he passes to Shaft. Shaft untaps, draws, and plays a mountain as land for turn. He follows it up by paying 4 for a 1 ring. This gives Shaft protection from everything until his next turn. He later taps his Arcane Signet to pay 1 for Esper's trigger. Shaft then upticks 1 loyalty counter on Koth to a total of 2 to untap a mountain. Shaft then passes the turn to me. I untap, draw, and pay 3 to cast Kira Great Glass Spinner. I then play a tapped Hall of the Storm Giants as land for turn. Paying 2, I then cast a Talisman of Progress. Going to combat, I swing Ragavan at Koth. In response, Shaft taps the 1 ring and puts a burden counter on it to draw a card. Not finding an answer, Shaft declares no blocks and Koth is knocked out. With that, I pass the turn. Chris untaps, draws, and pays 3 and 2 life, going down to 33 to cast a Birthing Pod. This triggers Esper, and Chris doesn't pay the 1, so I draw. He then pays 1 mana and another 2 life to sacrifice Selfless Spirit and puts Eternal Witness onto the battlefield. When an Eternal Witness enters, Chris can return a card in his graveyard to hand. He chooses to grab the Farseek. He then plays a Deserted Beach and passes to Ken. On Chris's end step, Ken casts a Born Upon a Win and pays the Esper tax to draw a card. Ken then untaps, draws, and plays a tapped Temple of Deceit. It enters as a mountain because of Magus, so he doesn't scry. Paying 4, Ken casts Alela, Cunning Conqueror. He then passes the turn to Shaft. Shaft untaps and takes 1 damage from the 1 ring burden counter. He then taps the 1 ring before the draw step to draw 2 cards, adding a second burden counter to it. Shaft then draws for turn and plays a mountain. Paying 2, he equips Sword of the Animus to Magus of the Moon, and going to combat, he swings his Magus at Chris. This triggers the sword, and Shaft fetches up a basic mountain and puts it onto the battlefield tapped. Chris declares no blocks and takes 3 damage, going to 30. Paying 4, Shaft then casts Collective Defiance and escalates once so he can choose an additional mode. Unable to pay the 1, I draw from Esper. Shaft then chooses to do 4 damage to Ken's commander and the second mode to discard his hand and draw that many cards. He discards 4 and draws 4. With both modes declared, Ken has no response as commander is destroyed and he returns them to the command zone. With that, Shaft passes to me. I untap, draw, and play a command tower. I then pay 3 for Heuristic Study. Moving to combat, I swing at Shaft with his commander, and since he has no response, Ragavan triggers, gets all the bonks in, and Shaft exiles a mountain, and I create a treasure token. I then pass to Chris. Chris untaps, draws, and casts a Farseek. He doesn't pay for Esper or Heuristic, so I draw 2 cards. He pays 1 mana and 2 life to activate Birthing Pod to grab Rampant Rejuvenator. Enters with 2 counters on it, and when it dies, Chris can grab a basic land equal to its power. Chris then passes to Ken. Ken untaps, draws, and pays 4 for Glen Alendra Archmage. He then passes the turn to Shaft, and I remember the Heuristic trigger. Ken doesn't pay, so I draw. Shaft untaps, takes 2 damage from the 1 ring, going to 33 life, and then he taps it to draw 3 cards and adding a 3rd burden counter to it. Continuing on, he then draws for turn and pays 4 for Duretti Scrap Scavin. This triggers Esper and Heuristic. Scaff doesn't pay, and I draw 2. He then uptakes Dreddy by 2 loyalty, putting them back to 5 loyalty to discard 2 cards and draw 2. He then plays Valakut, the Molten Pinnacle assigned per turn, and casts a Mind Stone. He doesn't pay the 1 and I draw. Chaff then pays 2 to suspend Wheel of Fate with 4 suspend counters on it. Moving to combat, he swings Magus at Ken for 3 damage. On attack, the sword triggers and he fetches up a basic mountain and puts it into play tapped. Ken declares no blocks and takes the 3, going to 37 life. With that, he passes to me. On Chaff's end step, I cast a Resculpt attempting to exile the Birthing Pod. Chris has no response, so it's exiled, and he makes a 4/4 elemental token. I untap, draw, and play a Plains land per turn. Going to combat, I swing Kira and Esper at Dreddy and Ragavan at Chaff's face. With no response, Dreddy is knocked down to 2 loyalty, and Chaff exiles a mountain. I then make a treasure token. Second main phase, I pay 5 for Dragon Lord Ojitai. I then pass the turn and move to end step where I discard down to hand size. Chris untaps, draws, and pays 4 to cast his commander, Brenard Ginger Sculptor. Rhystic triggers, and he pays 1. He then evokes Muldrifter for its evoke cost and draws 2. Muldrifter dies as part of the evoke cost and triggers Brenard. This makes a 1/1 Food Golem token copy of Muldrifter, and Chris draws another 2 cards. Moving to combat, Chris swings the 4/4 elemental at Dreddy. Chaff has no response, so Dreddy is knocked out. He then passes to Ken. Ken untaps, draws, and plays a Puppeteer Click for 5 mana. On ETB, he can put an opponent's creature in a graveyard onto the battlefield under his control, and then it will be exiled at Ken's end step. He selects the Zealous Conscript from Chaff's graveyard. This allows him to untap and gain control of target permanent until end of turn. Rhystic triggers on the Puppeteer cast, and Ken doesn't pay, so I draw a card. Ken then selects the One Ring on his target. Chaff has no response, so Ken then gains control of the ring. He then taps it, adding a 4th counter to it, and draws 4 cards. Ken then swings the Zealot Conscripts at Chaff. Chaff takes 3 damage, going to 28. Moving end step, Ken exiles the conscripts, and Chaff gains control of his 1 ring again. Chaff untaps, loses 4 from the ring, then removes a suspend counter from the Wheel of Fate, going to a total of 3. He then pays 1 for Faithless Looting and pays 2 for Esper and Rhystic. Faithless then resolves, so Chaff draws 2 cards and discards 2. Chaff then pays 5 for Call for Aid targeting me. Rhystic triggers and I draw 1. I then cast Swords to Plowshares targeting the Glen Alundra Archmage. In response, Ken counters the swords by paying 1 to sacrifice Glen Alundra Archmage. Persist triggers, and it returns to the battlefield with a -1/-1 counter on it. I then pay 3 for Your Temple is under attack to give my creatures indestructible until end of turn. In response, Chaff taps the One Ring and draws 5 cards. Chris says that if Chaff can get rid of the Magus of the Moon before his turn, he can do something about my board state. Chaff agrees to this deal, and then Chaff gains control of my creatures until end of turn and is unable to attack me with them. He plays a mountain and pays 1 for a Soul Ring. He then decides to not attack with my creatures and sends the Magus at Chris. On attack, Sword triggers and he grabs a basic mountain. Chris blocks with his Rampant Rejuvenator. It dies, and Brenard triggers, making a 1/1 Cookie Golem copy of it. Additionally, when Rampant Rejuvenator dies, Chris can fetch 2 basic lands and put them onto the battlefield untapped. He grabs a basic Plains and Forest. Chaff then plays War's Toll, which forces us to tap all of our lands if 1 land is tapped, and attack with all of our creatures if we attack during combat. Chaff doesn't pay the 1 and I draw. He then passes the turn to me. I untap, draw, and play an island as land for turn. I then tap all of my lands due to the War's Toll, float 7 mana, creating 4 blue and 3 white mana. Chaff realizes he missed his Valakut trigger and sends 3 damage to my face. I go to 37 life. I then continue my turn to cast a Preordain for 1 blue mana, scrying 2, keeping 1 card on top, and putting another to the bottom. I then draw the card I left on top. I use the remaining floating mana I have to cast Kari the Swirling Sky. Moving to combat, I have to swing with all of my creatures, so I send Dragonlord Ojitai, Esper, Ragavan, and Kira at Chaff for 10 damage. Unable to block, he takes the 10, going to 14 life. Ojutai and Ragavan trigger from combat damage. Shaft exiles a Hedron archive, and I make a treasure token. Ojutai triggers next, and I look at the top 3 cards in my library, put 1 in my hand, the rest onto the bottom of my library. I then have to discard down hand size, and I pass to Chris. Chris untaps, draws, and goes right to combat. Swinging Brenard, his 1/1 cookie, and the 4/4 elemental at me for 9 damage, I block Brenard with my Kari and take 7, going to 30 life. He taps all of his lands, making 9 floating mana to cast a Farewell, selecting all modes for 6 mana. Rhystic Study and Esper trigger. In response to the Rhystic triggers, I attempt to counterspell the Farewell. Chris pays for the Rhystic, but not for Esper, so I draw. In response to my counterspell, Chris casts Arcane Denial. I have no more mana, so Arcane resolves, and the next upkeep I'll draw 2 and Chris draws 1. I draw from Rhystic, and then Farewell resolves, and all of our stuff is exiled. Shaft returns Ragavan to the command zone. Chris then passes the turn to Ken. Ken untaps, Chris and I draw for Arcane Denial, and then Ken draws for turn. Ken plays an island as land for turn and pays 4 for a Blightwing Bandit. Ken then passes to Shaft. Shaft untaps, draws, and removes a suspend counter from Wheel of Fate. He then pays 1 to cast Lightning Bolt to deal 3 damage to Blightwing Bandit, killing it. He then pays 5 for a Reforge of the Soul, forcing us to discard our hands and draw 7. In response, Ken flashes out a Fairy Mastermind, and in response to that, Shaft casts a Pyroblast countering the Fairy Mastermind. Reforge the Soul resolves, and then Shaft plays a Mountain as land for turn. Valakut triggers and Shaft sends 3 damage at Ken, bringing him down to 34 life. He then pays 4 for a Solemn Simulacrum and fetches up a Mountain. This triggers Valakut, and this time he sends the 3 damage at my face, and I go down to 26 life. He then passes to me. I untap, draw, and play an island as land for turn. I then pay 4 to cast Michigo Kanda Truth Seeker. I then pay 3 for a Monastery Mentor. With that, I pass to Chris. Chris untaps, draws, and pays 6 to recast his commander Brenard Ginger Sculptor. He follows that up by paying 4 to cast Mondrak Glory Dominus. He then plays Boseiju Who Endures as land for turn. Paying 2, he casts Sakura Tribuilder. With that on the stack, I cast Path to Exile targeting Mondrak. Chris has no response, so it's exiled. Chris can fetch up a basic land as part of the cast for Path and put onto the battlefield tapped. He grabs a forest. Monastery Mentor triggers, and I make a monk creature token with prowess. Chris then moves to end step. Ken untaps, draws, and plays a Demolition Field as land for turn. He then pays 6 to recast his commander Elena Cunning Conqueror. With that, he passes to Shaft. Shaft untaps, and the Wheel of Fate goes down to 1 suspend counter. Shaft then draws and plays an Evolving Wilds. He sacks it to fetch up a mountain and puts it into play tapped. Valakut triggers, and he sends 3 damage at my Monastery Monk. He then pays 3 for a Cursed Mirror and has it become a copy of Brenard. Shaft then pays 5 and casts a Kiki Jiki. We have no response, so it resolves. He then taps Kiki to make a token copy of Solemn. When the token copy enters, Shaft grabs another mountain and puts it into play tapped. Valakut triggers and Shaft targets me. With that trigger on the stack, we see that Shaft can target me with Valakut triggers to use Michigo as a sack outlet. This would then trigger Brenard and make more copies of Kiki, who could make more copies of Solemn to trigger Valakut several more times. Ken decides to hold up his removal to interact if Shaft gets too wild with the triggers. The 3 damage goes at my face, and I go down to 23 life. Michiko triggers, and Shaft sacks the original Solemn and makes a cookie copy of it. He then fetches up a mountain and draws a card. This triggers Valakut again, and Shaft sends 3 damage at my face, triggering Michigo. I go to 20 life. In response to the Michigo trigger, Ken casts Fairy Fencing targeting the Cursed Mirror Brenard, killing it. This triggers his commander, and he makes a 1/1 Fairy Rogue with flying. Michigo triggers, resolves, and Shaft sacrifices his cookie copy of Solemn. When it dies, he draws a card. Shaft then pays 2 to cast an Idol of Oblivion. He taps it to draw a card because he made a token this turn. Shaft then pays 2 for a Dampening Spear, making each spell player casts cost more to cast for each other spell that player has cast this turn. It also makes lands that tap for 2 mana produce colorless instead. He then moves to end step, sacks his Kiki copy of Solemn, and draws a card. I then untap and draw, and going right to combat, I swing with Michiko and the prowess token at Shaft for 3 damage. He has no blocks, so he takes the 3, going down to 11 life. Second main phase, I then pay 6 for a farewell selecting all modes. Farewell resolves, and everyone exiles their boards again. I then pass the turn to Chris. Chris untaps and plays a Glacial Fortress. He then pays 8 for his commander, Brenard. He then pays 4 for Glenn Alindra Archmage of his own and passes to Ken. Ken untaps and draws and plays a Chefwreck March as land for turn. He then pays 8 to recast his commander, Alela. With that, he passes to Shaft. Shaft untaps and removes the last suspend counter from his Wheel of Fortune. In response, Chris pays 1 to sack Glenn and counters the wheel. Glenn's persistence trigger happens and Glenn returns with a -1/-1 counter on it. Shaft then draws for turn and pays 3 to cast Berkey, God of Storytelling. He then pays 2 for Helm of Awakening. Chris chooses not to counter it, so all our spells are now discounted by 1. On cast, Berkey triggers and Shaft gets a floating red mana. He then pays 4 to cast a discounted Wandering Archaic. Berkey triggers again, and Shaft has a floating red mana. Using the floating mana, he dashes in a Ragavan. Going to combat, Shaft swings Ragavan at me. I take the damage and go to 19 life. I then exile the top card of my library, revealing a Ponder. Second main phase, Shaft uses a treasure token to cast Ponder and creates another floating red mana. Ponder lets Shaft look at the top 3 cards of his library, put them back in any order, or shuffle his library, and then he can draw a card. He chooses to shuffle his library and draw a card. He then uses his 1 red floating mana to cast Gamble. Berkey triggers again and he creates another red floating mana. In response, Chris sacks Glenn and counters the Gamble. Brenard triggers and it comes back as a 1/1 cookie. Shaft then moves to end step, where the floating mana fizzles out and Ragavan returns to hand. With that, it becomes my turn. I untap, draw, and pay 3, thanks to the discount from Helm's Awakening to cast my commander, Taigam Ojitai Master. I then follow it up by paying another 3 to channel Ottawar's Soaring City to bounce the Wandering Archaic back to Shaft's hand. Shaft has no response, so returns to hand. I then pay 3 for Archmage and Myriadus. With nothing else I can do, I pass to Chris. Chris then untaps and casts a free Skull Clamp. He then pays another 1 to cast Esper. Paying 1 to equip the Skull Clamp to Esper, Esper dies, and in response to the Skull Clamp, triggers Chris casts Vantress Visions to copy its ability, so Chris draws 4 cards instead of 2. Brenard also triggers, making a 1/1 cookie token copy of it. Chris then pays 6 for a Coma Cosmos Serpent. Then, he pays 1 to equip the Skull Clamp to Glenn. With that, he passes to Ken. On his end step, Shaft flashes in an Embercleave and equips it to Berkey. Ken untaps, and on upkeep, Chris makes a 3/3 Coma Coil. Ken then draws for turn and plays a Swamp. He then decides to pass to Shaft, leaving up a suspicious amount of mana. Shaft then untaps, Chris makes a 3/3 Coma Coil, and Shaft draws for turn. We realize that Chris didn't draw from the Esper trigger when the Embercleave entered or was cast, so we let him draw. Then Shaft continues his turn and pays to cast Explorer the Vast Lands. He doesn't pay the 3 for the Esper trigger, so Chris draws. We all look at the top 5 cards of our library. We all reveal a land, sorcery, or instant, and we can choose to put those revealed cards in our hand or put the cards to the bottom of our library. Then we all gain 3 life. Shaft reveals a Blasphemous Act, I reveal Plains, Chris reveals a Path of Ancestry and Sky Shroud Claim, Ken reveals Rivendell. Shaft then casts the Blasphemous Act. Berkey triggers and makes a floating red mana. In response, Chris uses Glenn to counter it and draws 2 cards from Skull Clamp. Shaft then casts Ruination to destroy all non-basic lands. In response to the cast, Shaft taps his non-basic lands to create 2 floating red mana, adding 4 to his pool. Ken then uses his demo field to blow up my Castle Ardenvale. I grab a basic plains, and he gets a basic land. Ken then has another response and pays 3 for a Decoy Gambit. Alina triggers and he makes a 1/1 Fairy Rogue. This has each player choose whether Ken can draw a card or have a player return a creature. Ken chooses to return Berkey, and Shaft returns them, not wanting to give Ken a card. I let Ken draw so that he can try to dig for a counterspell. Chris lets Ken draw as well. We have no other responses, and Ken failed to find a counter spell, so our non-basic lands are destroyed, and Chef then uses 2 floating mana to recast Bergie. Paying 1, he casts Ragavan, and Bergie makes another floating red mana. Then paying another 2, he casts Feldon of the 3rd path, and Bergie triggers again. Before Chef changes phases and loses his floating mana, Chris channels Otawara to bounce the Feldorn back. Feldorn is returned to hand, and Chef casts Feldorn and passes the turn to me. I untap, Chris makes a Coma Coil, and I draw for turn. Going to combat, I swing my commander at Shaft for 3 damage. Shaft declares no blocks. I then cast Flawless Maneuver, giving all my creatures indestructible, hoping to draw a card from Archmage. It gains rebound because my commander attacked this turn. I then pay 1 for Wayfarer's Bauble, forgetting about the Helm Awakening discount. I don't pay for the Esper tax, and Chris draws. I then pay 2 to crack the bauble and put it in a tapped island. I then pass the turn to Chris. Chris untaps, draws, and pays 3 for an Anointed Procession. In response, Ken pays 2 for a Spell Stutter, countering the Anointed Procession. This triggers Alela, and he makes a fairy token. Chris then pays 3 to cast Sky Shroud Claim and fetches a Breeding Pool and a Temple Garden, and puts them into play untapped by paying 4 life. He then pays 2 for a Coiling Oracle. On ETB, Chris can reveal the top card of his library. If it's a land card, he can put it into play, otherwise he puts that card to hand. He reveals it to Fairy's Protection. Going to combat, Chris sends 3 Coma Coils at Shaft. Shaft blocks 1 with Bergie and the other with Ragavan, and takes 3, going to 8 life. Chris then sacks a Coma Coil to give Coma indestructible. Chris then moves to end step, where he needs to discard 3 to go down to hand size. Ken untaps, Chris makes a Coma Coil, and Ken draws for turn. He swings a 1/1 fairy at Chris. Chris can't block and takes the 1, and because combat damage was dealt, Alela can goad a creature, so Coma is goaded. He then passes to Shaft. Shaft untaps on his upkeep. Chris responds by sacking 2 Coma Coils to deactivate Embercleave and Feldorn's ability. Then, in response, Shaft pays 3 to activate the Feldorn and make a copy of Wandering Archaic by exiling it from his graveyard. Shaft then moves to draw, step, and pays 1 to play a Goblin Crater Maker. He then sacrifices it by paying 1 to deal 2 damage to my Archmage, killing it. He then pays 5 to dash in a Ragavan and moves to combat, sending Ragavan at me and the 4/4 Wandering Archaic at Ken. Ragavan triggers, and I exile a Plains, and Shaft makes a treasure. He then moves to end step, where the Wandering Archaic token copy is exiled. I then untap, Chris makes a coil, and my rebound Flawless Maneuver is cast for free, making my commander indestructible. Moving to combat, I swing my commander at Shaft for 3 damage, putting Shaft at 5 life. I then cast Ericness Vile Duplication, making a copy of my commander that has flying. It gains rebound. With that, I pass the turn to Chris. On my end step, Ken casts Asinine Antics for 4 to put cursed rolls on our creatures, turning them into 1/1s. We have no response, so all of our creatures but Ken's become 1/1s. Ken also makes another fairy. Chris untaps, draws, and pays 2 for Boromir, Warden of the Tower. Chris then pays 1 to equip the Skull Clamp to Coiling Oracle, allowing Chris to draw 2 cards. He makes a cookie token of the Oracle, and on the cookie's ETB, he reveals a Malakator Parody Overseer. Chris then pays 3 for a Winged Slicer, which makes a 3/3 on ETB and gives his golems flying. He then plays a High Market as land for turn, and uses it to sacrifice the Splicer, gaining 1 life. Brenard triggers and creates a cookie token of Winged Splicer. When it ETBs, Chris makes another 3/3 golem. Going to combat, Chris swings 3 Coma Coils, Coma, and Esper at Shaft. This is enough damage to knock out Shaft, so Helm is no longer discounting our spells, though we kept forgetting about the discounts anyways. With that, Chris passes to Ken. Ken untaps and pays 4 to cast Distant Melody. This will allow Ken to draw a card for each fairy he controls, and this allows him to draw 4 cards. He then passes to me. I untap, draw, and Irenicus's Vile Duplication rebounds, where I make a copy of my commander. Esper triggers, and I pay the 3. Moving to combat, I ask Ken if I can bonk him for 1 damage to try and dig for an answer. Ken agrees, so I swing at him with my token copy of my commander for 1 damage. I then pay 6 for Sublime Epiphany. It gains rebound and I choose to bounce back the Winged Splicer. I decide to make another copy of my token commander with flying and draw a card. In response, Chris casts a Teferi's Protection for 3 mana. Ken responds by casting Spell Stutter Sprite for 2 to counter Teferi's Protection. Sublime Epiphany targets resolve, so the token of Winged Splicer is bounced out of existence and Chris's golems lose flying. Ken then also makes another fairy token. I then pass to Chris. Chris untaps, draws, and pays 8 for Crater Hoof Behemoth, hoping to close out the game. We have no response, so Crater Hoof resolves, and then Chris moves to combat and bonks us all out of existence. Good game, Chris. That was awesome.
Well, that was an adventure. There's a lot that happened in that game, but
Yes.
it was fun. It was, for everything that went on, it was still an enjoyable experience. So big thanks to our guests for that one.
Yeah, I'd say like there's some really cool stack interactions that happen that whole game, but I think the reason why it turned into a 3-hour game, I don't know, I could be wrong on this, was 2 farewells, land destruction, and I don't even know what else at this point. Everything. Right. Lots of counter spells.
There's a complicated stacks and complicated stacks, I think.
It was very Avril Lavigne.
Right. So what do we think is going to be our card of the episode for this one? What are your thoughts?
I think it's Magus of the Moon, just because it was such an important early game disruptor, because it did mess with like my mana base. I know it messed with Chris's mana base pretty bad, where he had to like use maybe cards with a lot of utility differently just to get like basic lands so that he wasn't totally out of the game. So there's some creativity with that for sure. My favorite interaction was when Cursed Mirror, like Shaft cast Cursed Mirror to make a copy of Brenard, and then used Kiki Jiki to make copies of Solemn, and then Valakut was out, so every time a mountain entered it was dealing 3 damage, and I had Michigo out, and so Shaft was using Michigo as a sack outlet to keep throwing 3 damage at my face, and that was such a crazy interaction. So definitely runner up there. I don't know, out of that's MVP play? I don't know.
Right, yeah. Shaft always brings a complexity to the game when it comes to interaction, so it's fun. And also big congrats to Chris to finally cross that finish line and really be able to win the tide of the game at the end there. So again, big thank you to our guests. It's always fun to have friends on.
Yeah. And if you haven't subscribed to Chris, I would recommend checking them out. They're close to 500, so if you can help them get to the 500 YouTubies, that would be huge.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Chris does very similar as far as same kind of format for EDH content, where you get to see a lot of fun games and a lot of fun interactions. So
yeah,
if you love us, I promise you will also love Chris.
Yeah.
But, I think without any further ado, remember, if you enjoyed the video, give it a like and let us know your favorite card or your favorite interaction of the game, because it's always fun to have an outside perspective to see what other people think is the cool plays. But I think without further ado, we're gonna say goodbye now.
Yeah.
So goodbye.
Bye-bye now.